All right. So we're in landscape and macroecology, and we just went through this idea that you can scale based on, if you know what the physical constraints are, in this case, things like how you move, if you put a bunch of cells together to make a big organism, there's a little bit of energetic cost, and so overall you can put out more energy, but proportionally not as much for your biomass. You can imagine constructing a whole energy diagram like we had earlier in the ecosystems based on these kinds of things in a very theoretical and general sense. The recent thing that's come out is called macrosystems, and macrosystems is related tangentially to the NEON National Ecological Observatory network, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these are very large-scale approaches up to continental. And this idea has been going on for a long time. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the greatest scientists of the world, although people have talked about him being inventing nature. He was Prussian, which is German. And so in the US system, he's been sort of downgraded as not being so important. But he traveled around different parts of the world, South America, did things like put a horse in a pond with a bunch of electric eels to see what they did. But he also climbed the mountains in South America and came up with the idea of biomes, that as you went up, you got to more plant assemblages that were very similar at the top of these tropical mountains to the ones in the northern Europe where he was from. So these large-scale approaches have been out, but it's formalizing now. And I just want to talk about a few of these approaches with regard to the freshwater ecology. One point is that these are really accessible now because of large databases, mapping, and satellite imagery. So we're really able to get continental scales, global scale estimates. And I've talked about some of those through the class, but I'll be more specific. So this is one where myself and a group of my collaborators mapped the biome concept, the terrestrial biome concept, across the stream properties that we might expect with that. And we see that with precipitation increasing, right, this way, and the temperature then, and this could be altitude or temperature, also increasing. So if we have high temperature and high precipitation, we might have a tropical rainforest down here, right? If we have high temperature and low precipitation, then we would have a desert. And a lot of this is related to the idea of potential evaporation over transpiration over annual precipitation. So if the potential amount of precipitation falling exceeds that the vegetation can use on the terrestrial surface, then there's going to be a lot of runoff, right? Then this has a lot of implications for the aquatic habitats that are associated with that. So in this case, we would have perennial streams, right? And then going over to intermittent streams, and then ephemeral streams that very rarely flowed. So Kanza is here, and the tallgrass prairie is here. And we're perched right between the demand of the plants and the amount of precipitation. So some years it's really dry, and other years it's really wet. So we have this incredibly variable hydrologic flow. In contrast, in the tropical rainforest, it's raining a lot. It may be seasonal, but it's raining a lot, and so there's going to be perennial flow all the time. And then we can get to the amount of seasonality. It's less seasonal as so altitude, which gives you one way of looking at temperature. Mountains have low temperature and freeze and have characteristics similar to Arctic systems, but not exactly the same, because the Arctic systems will completely warm a lot in the summer and then go back to cold, whereas the tropical high altitude mountains are going to be cold all the time. And then we can go through things, how the terrestrial influences the aquatic, like closed canopies, right? So we talked about the river continuum concept and upstreams of closed canopy. If we go into grasslands and wooded grasslands, the canopy opens up, so you'd have higher production to ecosystem respiration. And then the organisms will relate to this as well. So you'd have shredders associated with streams flowing through forests and woodlands, maybe through grasses and woodlands. less so through desert and shrubs, maybe less so through tundra. And this is a way then to map our concepts, this concept of terrestrial biomes onto the aquatic environments that are embedded in them. And then we've taken it further and looked at how this might influence wetlands and lakes as well in some of our additional work following this. So let's say these are a series of questions. Can we make predictions based on the biomes and freshwater habitats occurring? So this will be question of the day. And I will pause the recording. Right, so habitats will be less dense and drier habitats. There will be less permanent and they'll be less connected. So do you think there will be more diversity or less diversity in those drier habitats? Less diversity, it turns out that that's true. How about the degree of endemicity? Do you think there'll be a greater proportion of endemic species or a lower proportion of endemic species in drier, less connected habitat? So we're getting a lot of people saying higher degree of endemicity, which makes sense, right? Because we've talked about reproductive isolation and geographic isolation being a way that new species form, right? And that's an important aspect. However, you also got less area. Turns out if we look at the proportion of endemic species, they actually tend to be lower. The highest proportion of endemic species is in, like tropical rainforests and the Appalachians and some of these other habitats. And maybe it's just because in these less permanent habitats, well, the Arctic one's pretty straightforward, right? Regardless of how wet or dry it is, because the glaciers just covered over. So there hasn't been a time there, but something like a desert, maybe everything dries every once in a while and it just all goes away. So there's not the time to develop the diversity and the endemicity that occurs in wetter habitats. All right, and so here's the series of plots of different areas. So Australian from dry to wet, basically. We're going from dry to wet here. When we go from brown to green, which makes sense, yellow for the grasslands in between. And we have these gradients from the Australian desert to the temperate rainforest, the Gobi Desert to the China coast, the Western Gobi to Europe, North American desert to the southeastern forest, Australian desert to the rainforest. I'm sorry, that was the temperate forest there. That's the other way. The Brazilian desert, Caatinga to the Amazon, the Namib, one of the driest deserts in the world, through the Kalahari and the tropical rainforest, and another Sahara desert to the Congo. All these sort of trying to keep latitude the same. And we see that in every case, the number of fish species and the number of amphibian species increases as we move across this gradient. And this is calibrated to area as well. Okay, so basically you're gonna have more species in the wetter habitats because of the permanence and there being just more habitat there. And I should say that the endemicity roughly follows this. So these are global estimates and we'll get to where those data came from in a bit. We can also think as we move across these gradients from high altitude to low altitude that diversity of everything should change. And this is just an example from Tom Batten's work that shows the microbial diversity. So we can now sequence all the microbes that are there and get an idea of what the diversity of the different major groups is. And we see these big shifts where this green beta proteobacteria are really prevalent in these high streams, but they become less and less prevalent as we move down into the low areas, right? And same with the red ones, the actinobacteria, they become more prevalent in the lower areas. I mean, in reverse, I'm sorry, they become more prevalent in the low areas. So we're just thinking of these very large scale gradients And the fact that habitat, you know, the abiotic gradients and how habitats lay out across those that I talked about near the end of the ecosystems chapter in a couple lectures ago. Here's another approach to break things up. This is Freshwater Ecoregions of the World, and the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy funded this project. And this is a little bit different because unlike biomes, which are, if you have, say, tundra, it can be in the high alpine areas, or it can be far north or south, right, where high latitudes. The same species of plants are not always there, you know. So you can think about the forbs dominate in Euphorbiaceae dominates in the deserts in this area, whereas the cacti dominate in the deserts this area for terrestrial biomes, but we still call them deserts. This basically says where do we get unique fish assemblages and amphibian assemblages, and breaks it up. And we can see some things where there's a lot denser variation in diversity in these tropical areas, right? These are the wet tropical areas. The drier areas are less dissected, and these cold areas are, you know, pretty homogeneous relative to some of those. And we get into some of these areas like down in New Guinea, where there's just these really sharp delineations of very unique fauna.
What's happening on all the islands?
You can't really see them very well. I think they just kind of blobbed them out, so they put them in as their own areas. Each one is their own area, but they basically are their own ecoregion because organisms are able to unique organisms evolve there, and a lot of the freshwater ones, animals just come from the ocean from there and develop unique species, crabs, shrimps, fishes that adapt to freshwater or semi-terrestrial. In terms of the crabs, sometimes a lot semi-terrestrial. Good question. Thanks. Another way to think about this is how nutrient ecoregions, and this is from the Environmental Protection Agency, and they've come up with this idea that there are these baseline nutrient concentrations, and we may have some areas like the high mountains, which have relatively low nutrients. We're up in the glacial areas where the ice shield scraped everything off and left, you know, mainly granite, you know, there. Maybe the soil's built up over time, but you know, fairly nutrient poor areas. Whereas areas along the Mississippi River where the sediments have dropped, for example, over time, maybe more nutrient rich. And you know, the grasslands deserts have a different signature, more phosphorus that turns out more sediments than areas that are more vegetated. This is important because when you say, okay, we're going to control eutrophication in Kansas, one of the questions would be, well, what is the nutrient ecoregion you're in? Because that'll tell you what your baseline nutrient concentrations are. And that, we can see this ecoregion here is the Flint Hills, right? And that's kind of like the grassland, the tall grasslands elsewhere. And it turns out we have really good water quality in the Flint Hills, and we can expect to get pretty low nutrients. Less so in western Kansas, where there tends to be a little bit more leaching of nutrients out of the glacial till sediments, and the blow off, aeolian deposition, the wind blowing dust in from the west. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't really talk that much about that. I didn't put that one up there, but I mentioned that NEON, National Ecological Observatory Network's going in. And it basically is sprinkling observation sites across roughly different biomes across the country, and including Alaska and Puerto Rico and Hawaii. But they have a detailed terrestrial sampling site and a detailed aquatic sampling site, both sensor stuff like carbon flux, oxygen concentrations in the water, light, temperature, all those things, but also biological collections. And they want to go for 30 years on this. So this is a continental scale macrosystems approach. This might be important to you all because there are jobs for people to go out and do this kind of sampling. And hopefully the kind of things that I've taught you in this class related to working in the field are going to be helpful and understanding how selling yourself as far as that, and understanding the kinds of requirements there might be.